Eric thought he had the perfect marriage, a beautiful wife, shared memories, and a future full of promise. But everything shatters when a single text message reveals Jennifer's betrayal. What begins as a carefully plotted confrontation spirals into an unexpected, tragic reckoning. As secrets unravel, Eric discovers that revenge comes at a price, and some truths cut too deep to heal. A haunting tale of love, betrayal, and the irreversible consequences of choices made when hearts break. The road stretched out endlessly before us, winding through the dark North Carolina woods. The headlights of our SUV carved a lonely path in the night, their glow bouncing off the reflective signs that pointed the way to our mountain cabin. A vacation, Jennifer had called it. We need this, Eric. Just us, no work, no stress. And like a fool, I believed her. Jennifer sat next to me in the passenger seat, humming softly along to a playlist she'd made. The sound of her voice used to make me feel content. Now, it grated on me, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she'd been distant for weeks, months, if I was being honest. Late nights. Mysterious text messages. A sudden interest in yoga retreats that left her gone for entire weekends. I wanted to trust her. I had no reason not to. 9 years of marriage isn't something you throw doubt at lightly. But the gut feeling I had wouldn't let go, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Something wasn't right. And tonight, I would find out just how wrong things were. I need to use the bathroom, Jennifer said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her tone was light, casual. Gas station's a bit up ahead, I replied, eyes on the road. Can we stop at the Wawa? It's closer. I glanced at her. The Wawa was just off the next exit. Strange. She was never this insistent about bathroom stops. But I nodded. Sure. Minutes later, I pulled into the Wawa parking lot. The place was mostly deserted, save for a couple of trucks parked near the pumps. Jennifer grabbed her bag, smiling as she unbuckled. Be right back, she chirped, already halfway out the door. I didn't watch her go. I leaned back in my seat, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone, trying to ignore the unease in my chest. A breeze slipped in from the cracked window, and as I adjusted in my seat, something caught my eye. Her phone. Jennifer's precious phone sat face down on the seat where she'd dropped it. She never left it behind. I joked once that it was glued to her hand. The woman couldn't be separated from it for more than a few seconds. I told myself to ignore it. It wasn't any of my business. But then the screen lit up. One new message. I stared at it, the soft glow illuminating the dark interior of the car. Just don't look, Eric. Let it go. Trust her. But my gut didn't trust her, and neither did the whisper in the back of my mind. I grabbed the phone. The message preview sat like a landmine on the screen. I can't wait for tomorrow. He'll never know. The words were simple, yet they sliced through me like a jagged blade. My breath hitched. My fingers tightened around the phone. Tomorrow. Tomorrow was when I'd planned our big hike, the one she said she couldn't wait for. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I unlocked her phone, my hands trembling as I navigated to her messages. The text thread was there. A name stared back at me, Chris. Hope he buys your lies. I miss you, baby. Just tell him you're meditating. Chris. I knew the name. Jennifer had mentioned him a couple of times in passing, a colleague, she said. Newly divorced. Nothing to worry about, Eric. Just work. I sat frozen, my mind spiraling. My wife was cheating on me. My wife was cheating on me tomorrow, right under my nose. Suddenly, the passenger door swung open, and Jennifer climbed back into the car. She moved fast, too fast, her hair a little messy, her breath slightly uneven. She froze when she saw me holding her phone. What are you doing with that? Her voice was sharp, defensive. I looked at her, trying to keep my expression blank. It lit up. I thought it might be something important. She snatched the phone out of my hand, her fingers fumbling as she locked it. Her face had paled, but she tried to cover it with an annoyed laugh. Jesus, Eric, you scared me. It's just work. I nodded slowly, my chest tight with the effort to stay calm. Work? Yeah, Chris from accounting. He's been driving me crazy with last-minute stuff for the quarter-end reports. Nothing exciting. She glanced at me, forcing a smile. Her hand was shaking. I let it go. Or at least, I let her think I did. Okay, I said, starting the engine. Let's get to the cabin. She sighed with relief and leaned back into her seat, scrolling through her phone now as if nothing had happened. I stared at the road ahead, my mind churning. By the time we reached the cabin, Jennifer seemed to have completely forgotten the Wawa incident. She was chatty again, slipping back into the role of the carefree, doting wife. She gushed about how beautiful the cabin was, how perfect this little getaway would be for us. I played along. Smiled. Carried the bags in. The cabin was quaint, nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and quiet night. It was exactly the kind of place Jennifer loved, cozy, secluded, romantic. And yet, all I could think about was how she'd planned to meet her lover tomorrow. Inside, she lit a fire while I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkness. My hands curled into fists at my sides as I tried to work through what I'd seen. Every time I blinked, I saw that text. He'll never know. I did know. And she didn't have the faintest clue. Eric? I turned to see Jennifer smiling at me from across the room, holding 2 glasses of wine. Come sit with me by the fire, she said softly. Let's relax. Forget the world for a bit. I took the glass she offered, forcing a small smile. She curled up on the couch, patting the spot next to her. I sat down stiffly, the warmth of the fire prickling at my skin. Jennifer took a sip of her wine, sighing contentedly. I'm really glad we did this, she said, looking at me with those bright, blue eyes. We needed this, don't you think? I stared at her, my jaw tight. Yeah, I muttered. We really did. She leaned her head on my shoulder, oblivious to the storm building inside me. My thoughts churned relentlessly. I wanted to scream at her. Shake her. Demand to know how she could do this to me. But I didn't. I stayed calm. Because I had a plan. Later that night, once Jennifer was fast asleep, I quietly slipped out of bed. Her phone lay on the nightstand, locked and silent. I didn't need it anymore. I had the number, Chris's number, seared into my brain. In the glow of the cabin's tiny kitchen light, I sat down at the table and pulled out my own phone. I used a burner app to mask my number and typed out a message. Chris, this is Eric. Jennifer's husband. I know about you too. Don't worry, I'm not mad. If you're serious about her, I'll step aside. Let's meet tomorrow at noon, at the clearing by the waterfall. I stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send. The reply came almost instantly. What? Who is this? I smirked faintly. Hooked. Like I said, I'm her husband. I want her to be happy. If you're the one making her happy, let's talk about it like men. Tomorrow. Noon. The clearing. There was a long pause before the reply came. Fine. I'll be there. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. The bait was set. Chris had no idea what was waiting for him. Jennifer shifted in her sleep from the other room, and I looked toward the dark doorway. For a moment, I almost felt sad. I'd loved this woman once. Trusted her. Built a life with her. Now, all I felt was cold determination. Tomorrow, she would get what she deserved. I turned off my phone and slipped back into bed, careful not to wake her. She murmured something in her sleep and nestled closer to me, her breath warm on my shoulder. I didn't move. I stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. The morning light seeped in through the thin curtains, painting the wooden walls of the cabin in soft gold. I lay still, staring at the ceiling as Jennifer's quiet breathing filled the room. She was curled up next to me, oblivious to the wreckage she had caused. I should have felt anger, rage, even, but what I felt now was colder, sharper. The kind of clarity that comes when you know exactly what you need to do. Her phone buzzed faintly on the nightstand. Jennifer shifted and let out a soft groan, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I glanced at the screen without moving, noting the message preview. See you soon. Chris. Jennifer stirred, reaching for the phone with an automatic, practiced motion. She unlocked it, glancing at the screen, and I watched her try to suppress the tiniest smile. She turned onto her side, back toward me, and began typing quickly. I rolled over and sat up, stretching slowly as though I hadn't just seen it all. Morning, I muttered, my voice deliberately groggy. She jumped a little but recovered quickly, locking her phone. Morning, babe, she replied, her voice too cheerful. You sleep okay? Like a rock, I lied, standing and grabbing a fresh t-shirt. What time is it? Just after 7. I'll make us some coffee. She swung her legs out of bed and slipped her feet into a pair of slippers, tucking the phone into the pocket of her hoodie. It's going to be a beautiful day, you know. Perfect for that hike you mentioned. I stared at her for a moment, my mind turning. Yeah, I said slowly, forcing a small smile. Perfect for that. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the sound of running water drown out the quiet chaos in my head. She's meeting him, I thought. And I'm going to let her. The morning unfolded like a play, every line rehearsed. Jennifer was sweet, smiling at me over breakfast like nothing was wrong. She wore her favorite hiking gear, leggings, a fitted fleece jacket, and a ponytail that made her look younger. For a moment it was like looking at the woman I married. But the woman I married wouldn't be smiling at me like this while planning a secret rendezvous with another man. I matched her energy, playing the part of the loving husband. We packed snacks, water bottles, and a small blanket. Jennifer insisted on taking a couple of photos together before we set off. For memories, she said, smiling brightly. Memories, I thought bitterly. The trailhead wasn't far from the cabin, and we fell into a steady rhythm as we hiked through the forest. Sunlight streamed through the trees in shifting patterns, and the sound of birdsong mixed with the crunch of gravel beneath our boots. Jennifer chatted aimlessly, pointing out wildflowers and stopping occasionally to take photos of the scenery. I let her lead, giving her the illusion of control. In truth, I knew where we were going. The clearing by the waterfall was a spot Jennifer had found during one of her yoga retreats, a peaceful little paradise, she had called it. A place where she could center herself and escape the stress of the world. Apparently, it was also the perfect spot for cheating. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun had climbed high, and the sound of rushing water filled the air. The waterfall was beautiful, tumbling down a wall of mossy rock into a crystal-clear pool below. Jennifer dropped her backpack, stretching dramatically. This is perfect, she said, turning to me with a smile. Don't you think? Yeah, I replied, my voice neutral. It really is. She glanced at her watch, and her smile faltered. Hey, why don't you relax here for a bit? I think I saw a path back there I want to explore. Just for a few minutes. I raised an eyebrow. Alone? She hesitated, her expression carefully neutral. It's no big deal, Eric. I just want to stretch my legs. You can stay here, enjoy the view. I'll be right back. There it was. The lie. Smooth, practiced. I wondered how many times she had fed me something similar. I looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. She fidgeted under my gaze. "Okay," I said finally. "Take your time." Her relief was almost palpable. She grabbed her water bottle, slung her phone into her pocket, and hurried off down the trail. I waited until she was out of sight before I stood, dusted off my jeans, and followed her. The trail twisted and turned, cutting through dense trees and shadowed groves. Jennifer was moving fast, too fast for someone who was stretching her legs. I kept my distance, careful not to make a sound. After about 10 minutes, the trees opened up into a second clearing, smaller than the first. And there he was. Chris. He was leaning against a tree, a smug grin plastered across his face. Athletic, sharp-featured, with a cocky confidence that set my teeth on edge. Jennifer emerged from the trail, breathless and smiling. "Hey," she said softly. "Hey yourself," Chris replied, pushing off the tree. He stepped closer, his hands resting casually on her hips as he pulled her in for a hug. I felt bile rise in my throat as I watched her melt into him. "I can't believe you made it," Chris murmured. "I thought he'd never let you out of his sight." Jennifer laughed, low and quiet. "I told you I could handle it. He doesn't suspect a thing." "Doesn't suspect a thing?" I nearly laughed out loud. Chris tilted his head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You look amazing. You always do." Jennifer blushed like a schoolgirl, and for a split second, I didn't recognize her. This wasn't the woman I'd built a life with, the woman who shared my bed and bore my last name. This was a stranger. A liar. Chris leaned in, and I knew what was coming. I stepped out of the shadows. "Well, isn't this cozy?" The sound of my voice cracked like a whip. Jennifer froze, her face going pale as she turned toward me. Chris dropped his hands and stepped back, confusion flashing in his eyes. "Eric," Jennifer breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris recovered quickly, his expression hardening. "Who the hell are you?" "I'm her husband," I said, stepping closer. My voice was calm, steady, nothing like the storm raging inside me. "You must be Chris." He faltered at that, glancing at Jennifer. "You told him?" Jennifer shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "Eric, I..." "Save it," I cut her off sharply, my eyes never leaving Chris. "I texted you last night, Chris. Told you I wanted to meet." His face paled. "That was you?" "You're damn right it was," I said. "You thought you were meeting the man whose wife you've been screwing. Congratulations. Here I am." Jennifer took a step toward me, her hands trembling. "Eric, please." "Don't," I snapped, turning my gaze to her. "Don't you dare beg me now. I gave you everything. My trust. My time. My life. And this is how you repay me." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Chris, ever the tough guy, stepped forward. "Look, man, this isn't what you think." "Shut up," I growled. "You don't get to talk. You don't get to say a damn word to me. You're nothing. Less than nothing." Chris's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He was bigger than me, sure, but I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Jennifer broke the silence, her voice cracking. "Eric, I'm sorry. Please, just let me explain." I laughed bitterly. "Explain? There's nothing to explain, Jen. I saw the texts. He'll never know, right?" "Well, I know. And now he does too." Her face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It just happened." "It just happened," I repeated, shaking my head. "That's rich. You planned this. Lied to my face. Came here to meet him while I sat back at the cabin, playing the fool. Chris shifted uncomfortably, his bravado cracking. Look, man, maybe we should. Shut up, I snapped, turning to him again. You don't get to act like you're the good guy here. You knew she was married. You knew, and you didn't care. He didn't respond. Jennifer sank to her knees, sobbing quietly into her hands. For a moment, I just watched her, the weight of everything crashing down on me. The woman I loved, the life we built, all of it was gone. I turned on my heel and walked back toward the trail. You can have her, Chris, I called over my shoulder. Good luck. You'll need it. I didn't look back as I disappeared into the trees. The trail seemed longer on the way back, the uneven crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound keeping me company. Sunlight cut through the dense canopy above, illuminating patches of earth, but everything felt dim to me now. My mind was a storm of anger, betrayal, and the aching pull of memories I'd rather forget. I had seen enough back there, Jennifer clinging to Chris like he was her salvation. I stopped at the clearing where we'd started, the roar of the waterfall crashing into the pool below. For a brief moment, I let myself breathe. The air smelled of moss and damp stone, but it did nothing to wash the bitterness from my throat. What now? That question sat heavy in my chest. I had confronted her, confronted him, but the reality hadn't hit me until now. It's over. 9 years of marriage, a life I had built with this woman, had unraveled in minutes. I dropped onto a flat rock near the water, staring at my reflection in the ripples. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. His face was gaunt, pale, his jaw clenched tight with unspoken fury. I looked older than I felt. Broken. Eric. Her voice shattered the silence, so soft I almost didn't hear it. I turned my head slightly and saw Jennifer standing at the edge of the clearing. She looked like a wreck, her face streaked with tears, her ponytail loose and disheveled. She clutched her hands to her chest like she was holding herself together. I didn't say a word. I let her speak first. Please, she whispered, stepping closer. Please talk to me. I shook my head, looking back at the water. I think we've said everything we needed to say, Jen. No. We haven't. Her voice cracked, but there was a note of desperation now. I messed up. I know I did. But I need you to hear me out. I turned to face her fully. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. Hear you out? I said bitterly. Fine. Let's hear it. What could possibly justify sneaking around with him? Jennifer winced at the venom in my voice, but she didn't turn away. She took another step forward. I didn't want this to happen. I swear to you. It wasn't planned. I laughed humorlessly. It wasn't planned. You texted him. You planned to meet him here, on our trip, Jen. I'm not stupid. She flinched, wiping at her tears with the sleeve of her fleece. It started small, she said, her voice trembling. I don't even know how. He was just there. We'd talk after work, grab coffee sometimes. It wasn't anything at first. And then? I demanded. And then I felt seen. I froze, narrowing my eyes at her. Seen. Yes. Her voice grew louder now, more desperate. I know that sounds stupid, Eric, but it's true. You were always so busy, so focused on work. It was like I was just there for you. Someone you came home to, not someone you noticed. I stood up sharply, my fists clenched at my sides. Don't you dare blame this on me, Jennifer. Don't you dare make this my fault. I'm not, she sobbed, her voice breaking. I'm not trying to blame you. I'm trying to explain. I felt like I was drowning, Eric. Chris made me feel alive again. He made me feel special. I spat. Loved. Don't finish that sentence, Jen. Just don't. Her shoulders shook as fresh tears fell, but I felt no sympathy for her. Not anymore. Do you love him? I asked suddenly, my voice low and cold. Her eyes widened, as if the question caught her off guard. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. That's all I need to know, I said. If you can't say no, you've already answered me. Jennifer sank onto a nearby rock, burying her face in her hands. For a moment, she looked so small, so fragile, like a woman who had just watched her world collapse. And maybe she had. But so had I. I walked back to the cabin alone, leaving Jennifer in the clearing. I didn't care where she went or how long it took her to follow me. My legs moved on autopilot, carrying me through the forest while my mind churned. Memories flashed in my head like a cruel montage: the day we bought our first house, the way she cried when she saw the ring, the night we sat by a fire just like this one and planned our future. That was the Jennifer I knew. Or thought I knew. But now, I didn't recognize her. I didn't recognize us. When I reached the cabin, I went inside and locked the door. The fire had died down to embers, casting flickering shadows across the floor. I dropped onto the couch and buried my face in my hands, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do now. Divorce. The word floated to the surface, cutting through the haze of my thoughts like a knife. Divorce wasn't something I ever imagined for us, but it was the only path left. She had killed the marriage, stomped on its ashes, and tossed me out into the cold. I grabbed my phone and stared at the screen. Chris's number was still there in the text thread from last night. My thumb hovered over it for a moment before I closed it. I didn't need to deal with him anymore. I had bigger things to figure out. The sound of footsteps on the porch made me look up. A moment later, the door handle rattled. Jennifer. I stayed where I was as she knocked softly. Eric? Silence. Eric, please open the door. I didn't respond. I know you're angry. I know I hurt you. But don't shut me out, please. Her voice cracked on the last word. I stared at the door for a long moment before finally standing and walking over. I unlocked it and swung it open, fixing her with a blank stare. She looked awful, her face red, her hair sticking to her damp cheeks. She didn't look like the confident, smiling woman I married. She looked like a stranger, worn down and defeated. You wanted to explain? I said, my voice flat. Go ahead. Jennifer stepped inside slowly, wringing her hands. She looked around the room like she was afraid to meet my eyes. I don't know where to start, she whispered. Start with the truth, I said. She looked up at me then, her eyes full of regret. I didn't come here to hurt you. I didn't want you to find out like this. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm sorry. Were you planning to meet him behind my back and then crawl into bed with me afterward like nothing happened? Stop it, she whispered, her voice shaking. Don't say that. It's the truth. Jennifer sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands again. I stood across the room, watching her like I would a dangerous animal. She looked broken, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not after what she had done. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry, Eric. I'm so sorry. I don't know how I let it get this far. Neither do I said coldly. But it did. And you can't take it back. She looked up at me, tears pooling in her eyes. I don't want to lose you. I stared at her for a long moment, my expression unyielding. You already have. Her face crumpled as the words hit her. She sobbed into her hands, her shoulders shaking. I turned away, unable to watch her fall apart any longer. I grabbed my keys off the counter and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked desperately. "Out," I replied without looking back. "I need air." I slammed the door behind me, leaving her alone in the cabin. Outside, the cool mountain air hit me like a wave, but it did nothing to clear the fog in my head. I stood on the porch for a long time, staring out at the trees, trying to make sense of everything. There was no going back. I knew that now. The woman I loved was gone, and I had no idea who this person in the cabin was anymore. But one thing was certain. This marriage was over. The wind had picked up by the time I returned to the cabin, carrying with it the biting chill of the mountain evening. The sun was sinking lower, staining the sky in shades of purple and crimson. I hadn't walked far, just down the dirt road and back again, but the time alone had given me little peace. My mind was still a storm. When I opened the door, the cabin was silent. The fire had burned down completely now, the last of the embers faint and gray. A strange sense of stillness hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I paused, standing in the doorway, suddenly uneasy. "Jennifer." No response. I stepped inside, my boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. Her backpack was still near the couch where she had dropped it earlier. The blanket was tossed haphazardly over one arm, like she'd been sitting there before she got up. "Jennifer." I called again, louder this time. The quiet that followed felt wrong. I made my way toward the bedroom, my stomach knotting tighter with every step. The door was ajar, and the dim light spilling from the hallway barely reached inside. I pushed the door open fully and stopped cold. Jennifer was lying on the bed, curled up on her side with her back to me. For a moment, it looked like she was asleep. The room was dark, the thin curtains rippling in the breeze from the open window. But something was off, something I couldn't quite place. "Jen." My voice cracked as I moved closer. She didn't stir. I reached the edge of the bed and placed a hand on her shoulder. Her body was cold. A sharp spike of panic shot through me as I turned her over. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, her lips faintly parted as if she had been mid-sigh. Beside her on the nightstand sat an empty bottle of pills, ones I recognized immediately as her anti-anxiety medication. "No," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "No, no, no." I shook her gently at first, then harder. "Jennifer, wake up." Nothing. I dropped to my knees beside the bed, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath me. My hands trembled as I checked for a pulse at her neck, at her wrist, anywhere. But there was nothing. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Jennifer was gone. I stumbled back, my breath ragged and shallow as the room spun around me. My wife, my Jennifer, was gone. The woman I had loved, hated, and confronted today was lying lifeless in front of me. Tears blurred my vision as a strangled cry escaped my throat. How had it come to this? How had we gone from that seemingly perfect marriage to this moment, this cold, dark finality? I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, and stared at her body. The fight, the betrayal, the confrontation, it all felt so meaningless now. I thought I wanted revenge. I thought I wanted her to hurt like I did. But seeing her like this, all I felt was emptiness. There would be no apologies now. No explanations. No closure. Just silence. By the time the police arrived, the sky had gone completely dark, and the cabin was filled with flashing blue and red lights. I sat outside on the front steps, my hands shaking as an officer questioned me. "You found her like this?" he asked gently, his pen hovering over a small notepad. I nodded, my voice hoarse. She wasn't breathing. There was an empty bottle on the nightstand. I didn't know. The officer glanced back toward the cabin, where another officer was talking quietly with the paramedics. I couldn't look inside. I couldn't bear to see them taking her away. What happened before this, sir? I swallowed hard, my throat raw. We had a fight. She was seeing someone else. The officer's expression remained neutral, but I could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. You were here alone with her? Yes, I whispered. He nodded and jotted something down. We'll need you to come with us to answer a few more questions. Standard procedure. I barely heard him. I was too far inside my own head, replaying the events of the day over and over like a film reel stuck on repeat. My words. Her tears. The way I walked out and left her alone in the cabin. I didn't want to lose you. Her voice echoed in my mind, a ghost that wouldn't leave. I had been so cruel, so cold. What if I had stayed? What if I had let her explain? Would she still be here? I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to steady my breathing. The what-ifs were unbearable. Days later, I stood at the edge of her grave, the cold wind whipping through my coat as a small group of mourners gathered around. Most of them didn't know the truth, only that Jennifer had died suddenly while on vacation with her husband. I hadn't spoken to Chris. I hadn't spoken to anyone, really. The pastor's words washed over me, meaningless in their attempt to offer comfort. I couldn't take my eyes off the coffin as it was lowered into the ground. Jennifer had been my world once. And even after everything, even after what she did, part of me still loved her. Grief is a strange thing. It doesn't care about betrayal, anger, or blame. It simply exists, gnawing away at you piece by piece. As the funeral ended, people approached me with hollow words of sympathy. I nodded, shook hands, and thanked them quietly, all the while feeling like a ghost in my own life. When the crowd thinned, I stood there alone, staring down at the fresh earth. I thought of our wedding day, the way she smiled as she walked down the aisle. I thought of the nights we spent laughing until our sides hurt. And I thought of that last moment in the clearing when I walked away, leaving her to her silence. I'm sorry, I whispered into the wind, though I wasn't sure who I was apologizing to, her, myself, or both of us. I turned and walked back toward my car, the sound of my footsteps the only thing breaking the stillness. The cabin was empty now. My life was empty. And no matter how much I wanted to change it, some endings were set in stone. I drove away without looking back, leaving the mountains, and everything I had lost, behind me.